my name is Basley. Today I'm going to be talking about breaking the cycle of family violence. My research question is, how do biological factors interact with environmental factors, and how do they increase physical aggression? And then what strategies are most effective in breaking the cycle of family violence? Okay, so for much of history, domestic violence wasn't just common, it was legal. Today, millions of people are still affected by domestic violence every single year. And many of those who experience it as a children are more likely to repeat it and experience it later in life. Early American laws allowed men to physically discipline their wives. It wasn't until the 1970s that domestic violence began to be treated as a serious social issue. When violence is normalized by society, it becomes much harder to break that cycle. And this normalization doesn't just stay in history or laws. It affects what happens inside homes and in childhood. We don't just teach children with words. We teach them with what we allow. So if a child grows up surrounded by violence, yelling, fear, and control, it doesn't feel wrong to them, it feels normal. Imagine a child sitting in their room, hearing yelling through the walls every single night. At first, they're scared. But over time, they stop reacting because it has become normal for them. And when aggression becomes normal in childhood, it's often repeated into adulthood. Violence isn't just anger, it's a learned behavior. And for many children, it becomes their model for love. And the most important part is, they don't even realize it's unhealthy because to them, that is what love has always looked like. So when they grow up, they're not choosing violence. They're repeating what they were taught. Physical aggression doesn't come from just one cause. It develops when biological vulnerabilities, like genetics and brain development, interact with environmental factors like trauma, poverty, and exposure to violence. However, if violence is learned, it means it can be unlearned. One of the strongest predictors of future violence in childhood is childhood exposure. Research shows that children who witness violence often develop behavioral and emotional problems. Over time, they begin to believe that aggression is how relationships work. This doesn't just affect emotions, it changes how the brain develops during critical stages. And that's how the cycle of violence continues across generations. Environmental stressors like poverty increase stress and conflict. When stress is constant, it overwhelms a child's ability to regulate their emotions. And when emotional resources are limited, aggression becomes more likely, especially when you combine it with biological vulnerabilities. For example, a child who grows up seeing constant arguments or physical violence may start to copy that behavior at school or in their life, by getting into fights or struggling to control their emotions. But over time, those behaviors can follow them into adulthood and their relationships. One biological factor is the MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene. It affects how the brain regulates mood and impulse control, and especially how we process our emotions like anger. But it's really important to understand that this gene does not cause violence. Instead, it creates a risk of vulnerability. To make this easier to understand, think of it like this. The gene is a seed, and the environment is the soil. They need each other to grow, and in this case, to happen. Research shows that aggression increases only when low MAOA gene activity is combined with childhood exposure or trauma. For example, one study found that individuals with the low MAOA activity were significantly more likely to experience aggressive behavior, but only if they had experienced abuse growing up. If they didn't experience that environment, they were no more aggressive than anyone else. This shows something really important. Biology doesn't decide your future on its own. The environment plays a huge role in whether that risk actually turns into behavior. So again, the MAOA gene does not cause violence. It just makes someone more sensitive to their environment. And that's why early support and safe environments matter so much. This is a chart showing the difference between low MAOA activity versus, it's like shaking, and high MAOA activity versus, and this is juvenile in their whole lifetime. The control is going to be gray, so that's people that have never experienced abuse, neglect, or anything in their life. And the black is going to be people that have experienced abuse and neglect. And then this going up is going to be violent and like antisocial behavior. So as you can see, the people with the low activity gene is going to be way higher than people with high. Okay. Trauma physically changes the brain. It affects the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, which processes fear, becomes overreactive, making a person more likely to see threats even when they're not there. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision making and impulse control, develops more slowly under stress. So instead of thinking first, the brain reacts first. This is why some people who have experienced trauma may seem overreactive to small situations. Their brain has been trained to stay on high alert for danger to keep them protected. So if someone is being yelled at, even though they might not be in danger, they're going to think they're in danger. Anything higher than just normal, they're going to have anxiety and get stressed out and maybe be a little violent. It's not that they want to react this way though, it's that their brain has adapted to protect them to survive from danger. And this is why it can feel automatic for some. This is the amygdala, obviously, and this is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, next, research shows that gender differences is also how aggression can be expressed. So men are statistically more likely to show physical aggression and engage in violent or criminal behavior, while women are less likely to show physical violence, but they can still experience the same emotional risk factors, like impulsivity, trauma, and difficulty regulating their anger. Sometimes this can show up differently. For example, women may be less likely to express aggression in emotional or verbal ways rather than physical ones. But the key point is this: the underlying causes, like trauma, stress, and brain development, are very similar for both. So this tells us something important. Aggression is not just about gender. It is not something that only affects one group. Instead, it is shaped by a combination of biology, psychology, and social influences working together. Social expectations can also play a role. Boys are often taught to suppress their emotions, like sadness, and are sometimes encouraged to express anger instead. While girls may be taught to avoid physical aggression, but not always taught how to properly process their emotions either. So over time, these patterns can influence how aggression shows up, but they don't change the root cause. And that's why solutions need to focus on emotional regulation and healthy coping skills for everyone, and not just one gender. So instead of asking, why are men more aggressive, or why don't women show this in the same way, we should be asking, how do we teach everyone healthier ways to deal with emotions? These are a couple charts that I wanted to point out. So this is just showing men in the experiences they've had versus women in the experiences they had. As you can see, men have not experienced as much violent behavior than women. Some of the ones I wanted to point out was 1 in 5 has experienced sexual violence for women. 1 in 20 men have experienced sexual violence. 1 in 13 men have experienced at least one incident of violence by an intimate partner, but only 1 in 4 women have experienced that too. 1 in 16 men have experienced at least one incident of violence by a partner, and only 1 in 6 women has experienced at least one incident of violence by a partner. The main statistic that I wanted to point out was that around 95% of victims of violence, whether women or male, have experienced violence from a male perpetrator. This statistic was interesting to me though because, like I said before, women and men have kind of grown up the same and they could have the same risk factors, but men have displayed this more than women, and it's more physically than emotionally. And then going down to this chart, this is men and women. As you can see on this chart, the statistics that are higher for women are going to be verbal, power and control are pretty similar, and psychological alone. So this is just showing that men are more physically violent and women can be more emotionally or verbally violent. And then the overall, any violence, men are 29.7 and women are only 23.3. The cycle of The cycle of family violence is not inevitable. Research shows that early intervention can significantly reduce future violence. Children learn from what they see. So when they experience empathy, communication, and healthy relationships, they learn a different model for love. For example, therapy and counseling can help children process trauma before it turns into long-term behavior. School programs can teach conflict resolution and emotional awareness. And even something as simple as having one stable, supportive adult in a child's life can significantly reduce the risk of future violence. Programs that focus on trauma, accountability, and emotional regulation have been proven to reduce reported violence. But prevention has to start early. In conclusion, physical aggression is shaped by biology and the environment working together. But because if violence is learned, it can be unlearned. If we address trauma early, support mental health, and model healthy relationships, we can break the cycle before it continues. So the question is, if we know violence can be prevented, why aren't we doing more to change it? Because if we don't break the cycle, it will just continue into the next generation.